Happy Monday, everybody. Thank you for joining us at Jerry's Parsha Ponderings. It is Monday, which is unusual for me to be doing a Parsha video, but it is also Erev, my father-in-law's yahrzeit. So we are dedicating our learning today, Le'ilui Nishmas, Reb Menachem Reb Yehuda, Zechrono Levracha. We will speak about him in a couple of minutes, but that is why we're doing this early this week. So we are going to be discussing Parshiot Vayigash and Vayechi. So let us start with Parshat Vayigash, last week's Parsha. And the Parsha starts off, Vayigash Elav Yehuda. Yehuda stood up and approached Yosef. Didn't realize he was Yosef yet. But he approaches the viceroy and takes ownership. And this is the key to what we will see in this week's Parsha, on the next slide. When we go through the Birchot Yaakov, Yaakov says, Lo tasur shevet mi Yehuda. Yehuda will be the king. What is it about Yehuda that makes him so regal? And for this, we have to hearken back a few weeks. Parshat Vayechi. We recall, and I spoke about this briefly, we recall the whole incident of, first of all, Yosef and the brothers in the pit, and the issue of Yehuda and Tamar. So let's just hearken back a second to the incident where Yosef was thrown into the pit and then subsequently. It was Yehuda that stood up and said, we're not going to kill anybody. We'll sell him to the Yishmaelim, the Midyanim, whomever they were, and sell him down to Egypt, thereby making sure that he is not killed. And then we see very soon thereafter the whole incident with Tamar. What happened with Tamar? Well, we know the story. He thought she was a lady of the evening. The whole thing with Yibum, with Er and Onan, and subsequently Shelah. He was afraid she was a katlanit, and he didn't want to give his son Shelah, and therefore he wound up being miyabem her, and from there came Peretz and Zerach, and from Peretz, of course, the entire Davidic monarchy ultimately came out of one-time union of Yehuda and. Why does the Torah tell us about this? That we know it's not exactly a very complimentary story regarding our future monarch. But the Torah is again teaching us a very important. The whole story of Yehuda, we see that with the case of Yosef and selling him into slavery, he kicking the can down the road, for lack of a better. All right, listen, we're not going to kill our brother here, but I don't know. Let's just sell him as a slave. At least he won't be dead, and we can deal with this on another day. Again, the same thing with Shelah. He procrastinated. He knew that he was in line to do Yibum. But when the whole thing happened with Tamar, and she said, to whomever this seal and this ring and this staff belong, I have become pregnant. That's when he said, tzadka mimeh. He owned up. When Yehuda was born, the Torah says, Leah said, Hapa'am oda et Hashem. I will now give thanks to Hashem. The word modim has two meanings. It means to give thanks, which is why modim is the one bracha in Chazaras Hashatz where we actually say it along with the Shliach Tzibur, because we have to give thanks to Hashem, not only via via proxy. And it also means to own up, to admit. Moide b'miktzah, someone who gives partial credit, right? He owned up, and we spoke about this. But it's important that we realize now in the context of Vayigash who Yehuda was. Yehuda, it now came time for him to own the selling of Yosef. He kicked it down the road, just like he did with Shelah and Erva Onan and Tamar, but he eventually owned up. Now it's time to own up again. Vayigash elav Yehuda, Vayomer bi Adoni. He said, take me as your slave. Let me be responsible. I am ultimately the one that has to stand and pay for this. And look at who he's telling it. An actual ruler. I mean, for all intents and purposes, a king. Not Pharaoh, but as close as you can get. And he said, no, I am responsible. And that's why Lo tasor shevet mi Yehuda. Now, what happened right after this entire incident? Yosef finally reveals himself to his brothers. And he says, Ani Yosef, it's me. It's Joey. And they were all like, hamina, 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 hamina. They didn't know what to say. Even Yehuda, who just owned this entire thing and said, I'm the guy who sold you into slavery. He was standing there like he had, Vayiv Halu, they didn't have a word to say. And realized that all of Sefer Bereshit is this whole story of Masa Avo Simon Labanim. It's telling us about all of Jewish history. We saw the incident with Yaakov being chased by Lavan in the body of water, and the 3 days and the 7 days. He found out on the third day that Yaakov ran, and he chased him for 7 days, just like the whole story of Paro and the Jews leaving Mitzrayim, and our entire 2,000 years of history they've been chasing. Finally, we're getting to the end of Sefer Bereshit. And what is it? Ani Yosef. Ani Yosef isn't only for what happened to the Achim, what happened to the brothers. It's a lesson for all of us. One day, it's not going to be Ani Yosef. It's going to be Ani Hashem. Whether it's in this world or in the next world. But one day, we're going to be standing there with our mouth. And this is especially important when we're learning for a yahrzeit. We're all going to the same place, people. And Hashem's going to say, Ani Hashem. Where were you? Ayeka, as he told Adam Harishon. Right? Were we faithful as Yosef was? We learned last week how Yosef went through the worst temptations, right? Whether it was being a slave or being in prison or being tempted by a master seductress mistress, Mrs. Potiphar. Yet he remained completely faithful. Will we be able to say Ani Yosef? Were we as faithful as Yosef? What does Yehuda say? How will I go up to my father without the lad, without Binyamin? But how will we go up to our father, and our youth is not with us? Did we waste our youth when we could have been using it to be faithful to our people, to our land, and to our God? Eicha ele alavi. Who said that? Yehuda. That's why Yehuda became the king. Rabbi Yisai, spoke about this as well. This is a little bit of Chazara, but the crossing of the hand. Ephraim and Menashe. Why? Why the whole Ephraim and... First of all, why Ephraim and Menashe? Well, we said last week, they were the first Jewish children born in Chutz La'aretz, and they were raised in Chutz La'aretz, and they remained faithful Jews. They remained true to the Torah, as it was at that time. Which is why we say Yisimcha Elokim K'Ephraim. But what's with the crossing? What did we just see with Yosef? That one was favored over the other, and that led to the whole thing. Yet, nonetheless, when Yaakov crossed his hands and said, no, Ephraim is the younger, but he will be the stronger of the Shvatim between Ephraim and Menashe. Why? Who came out of Ephraim? Yoshua ben Nun, who brought the people into the land. That's why Ephraim came first. Right? And Yosef nonetheless knew. I mean, he told them, put his hand, he's the older, he should be first. And Yaakov said to him, no, my son, this is a merits-based system we have here. And Yosef said, okay. He didn't object once his father explained. Because that is how our system. It's based on merit. It's not based necessarily other factors. And we saw the Birchot Yaakov. We see that each of the Shvatim had a different purpose. Each of the Shvatim in Israel had different ways of pronouncing the matter. They had different minhagim. They had different customs. They had different territory. Yet, they all got along. This is the lesson of the Birchot Yaakov. That we all, you have the Hasidim, and you have the Litvisha, and you have the Dati Le'umi, and you have a black hat and a blue hat and a gray hat and a yarmulke that's this, and a velvet yarmulke and a knitted yarmulke, and all sorts of different, and it doesn't matter. And sometimes no yarmulke, and sometimes tattoos. Yet, at the end of the day, we are one nation. And just like we learn on Sukkot about the different types of the four minim, right? There's the one that has learning, that Torah and good deeds, Torah but not good deeds but not so much Torah, and some that have nothing. Yet we are one tzibur. Tzaddik, Beinoni, Rasha, doesn't matter. We're still one nation, and that's why both Yaakov Avinu and Moshe Rabbeinu gave different blessings to the different tribes because they were all separate nation states. Sound familiar? They were each different nation states within one republic, and they all worked together to better Klal Yisrael and thereby better the world. This is the lesson of the Birchot Yaakov and the blessing of Ephraim and Menashe. So with all that, let's spend a moment and speak about my father-in-law, Menachem Bereb Yehuda. I got the Yehuda. My father-in-law was born in Poland in 1938. It was a Holocaust. He came to Israel at the age of in 1947. So he was a young lad, I believe about 17, right? 18. No, he was not. And he joined at that time. He says the greatest moment of his life was getting off that boat and being handed a gun. He fought to help build Israel. He ultimately became a naval officer. He was a Sgan Aluf. Our last name is Aluf. So when we got married, he told Bruchi, hey, now you outrank me. You're an Aluf. I was only a Sgan Aluf. And his lesson that always stayed with me is what you see on the screen. He said, remember, Yisrael is a combination of all the Avot. The Yod is Yitzchak and Yaakov. The Sin is Sarah. The Resh is Rivka and Rachel. The Aleph is Avraham, and the Lamed is Leah. Just think about what we just said about the Shvatim. While they were separate nation states, they were still one republic, one nation. And we are all made up of this DNA. The DNA of Yisrael. The Yashar El, those that are straight with God. Yisrael, we are the Sarim, the ministers of God to the world. That was what he always said to us, is that remember who you are and what's in your DNA. And he taught us about Yisrael, not only in terms of Am Yisrael, but also in terms of the nation of Israel, of the land of Israel, and how the Jewish people cannot be separated from the land of Israel, from the state of Israel, from the nation of Israel, and from the people of Israel. Because if we don't have that, we don't have our moledet, and we are basically cutting ourselves off. This is what kares is when you cut yourself off from your people and your land. And he always, it's tattooed on my brain, this lesson of you. And how he was a dugma ishit, a personal example of how a Jew should live with their connection to Eretz Yisrael, Dinat Yisrael, and Am Yisrael always. How appropriate that his yahrzeit is Asara B'Tevet. When Jerusalem was under siege and the walls of Jerusalem were being breached by the enemy, and here was a man who gave his life. He was wounded twice in combat in the 1948 War of Independence. How he gave his life in every sense of the word to combat that, to fight back the enemy, and to bring Am Yisrael back to its holy land given to us by the force, capital F, HaKadosh Baruch. Tiyeh nishmato tzrua b'tzor hachayim, yehi zichro baruch. May his neshama have an aliyah from our learning today, and may he continue to be a meilitz yosher for us, for our family, for Am Yisrael, for Medinat Yisrael, and Taka for all of Klal Yisrael. Rabbi Sai, Shabbos Makara Bracha. We're pretty far away from Shabbos here. It's Monday, but let's keep in mind, Hayom Yom Sheni b'Shabbat. Every day is getting us one step closer to Shabbat every single week. So plan ahead. May it be a beautiful one. Shabbat Shalom, well in advance. Thank you for joining us. Have a great week. Make it a great week, and make it a great week.